"Mrs. Gable," the Duke of Blackwood said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the oppressive silence of the dining room. "For 5 years, every Sunday, you have laid 2 extra places at this table." The housekeeper froze, her hand hovering over the silver soup tureen. She was a woman made of quiet loyalty and starched linen, her face a roadmap of sorrows she had witnessed but never caused. Her gaze flickered from the Duke's hard profile to the 2 gleaming, empty place settings that flanked his own at the head of the vast mahogany table. They were an accusation in polished silver and pristine porcelain. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, was not a man given to noticing such details. For 5 years, his life had been a hollowed-out husk of duty and drink. He ran his estates with a chilling efficiency, attended Parliament, and drank himself into a stupor most evenings in his library, surrounded by the ghosts of his own making. The world saw a powerful, implacable nobleman. Mrs. Gable saw a man drowning in a sea of his own creation, too proud to call for help. He had seen the plates before, of course. He had registered them as a flicker in his peripheral vision, a strange quirk of his long-serving housekeeper. He had dismissed them. But tonight, the emptiness of them screamed at him. The polished wood between his own setting and the vacant one to his right reflected the candlelight with a mocking gleam. It was a space a woman should occupy. The space on his left was for a child, an heir. His younger brother, Lord Caspian, who sat at the far end of the table like a well-dressed vulture, paused with a wine-glass halfway to his lips. A flicker of something, annoyance perhaps or alarm, crossed his handsome features before being smoothed away into an expression of mild curiosity. "A charming tradition, I'm sure," Caspian murmured, his tone laced with the silken condescension he had perfected into an art form. "Perhaps for friends who might one day surprise us." Alistair ignored him. His eyes, a startlingly sharp blue that had grown clouded and weary over the years, remained fixed on the housekeeper. "I am asking you now, Mrs. Gable, who are they for? Who is it that you expect who never, ever comes?" The old woman straightened her spine. The tureen in her hand seemed to weigh as much as the house itself. She met his gaze, and for the first time in 5 years, he saw not just deference in her eyes, but a profound and weary sorrow, and something else. Pity. It was aimed directly at him. "They are not for someone who might come, Your Grace," she said, her voice quiet but clear as a chapel bell in winter. "They are for those who should be here." She set the tureen down with a soft clink that echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous room. "They are for the Duchess," she stated, her chin lifting, "and for the heir that should be sitting beside you." The air thickened, growing heavy and suffocating. Alistair felt the words like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. The Duchess. Eleanor. A name he had forbidden from being spoken in this house. A name he had systematically tried to erase from his own mind, burying it under layers of anger, betrayal, and whiskey. Caspian let out a short, sharp laugh. "Good heavens, Mrs. Gable, still clinging to that old sentiment? The woman is gone. She made her choice. We all know what she was." Alistair's hand clenched into a fist on the damask tablecloth. The knuckles went white. He did not look at his brother. He could not tear his gaze from Mrs. Gable, from the unwavering truth in her tired eyes. She had been Eleanor's personal maid before she had been promoted to housekeeper. She had loved Eleanor, and she had stayed. He had always assumed her loyalty was to the house, to the title. He had been a fool. Her loyalty was to a ghost. "She is the Duchess of Blackwood, my lord," Mrs. Gable said to Caspian, her tone frosted with a contempt she rarely showed. "And she was sent away. There is a difference." "A difference of semantics," Caspian scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "No," Alistair said. The word was a rasp of sound, torn from his throat. It silenced the room. He finally looked down the long, lonely expanse of the table at his brother. No, it is a difference of everything." He rose from his chair, the legs scraping harshly against the polished floor. The grand room, with its high, vaulted ceilings and portraits of his ancestors, suddenly felt like a tomb. He had been presiding over a funeral for 5 years, and had never realized he was the guest of honor. The 2 empty places, for Eleanor, and for an heir. An heir. The thought struck him with the force of a physical impact. They had been married for just over a year when he had thrown her out. A brief, cold marriage, where he had been more interested in his ledgers and his political ambitions than the quiet, intelligent woman who tried so desperately to breach the walls he had built around himself. Had she been? Could she have been? He looked at Mrs. Gable, a desperate, unspoken question in his eyes. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. A single tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. It was all the confirmation he needed. The world tilted on its axis. 5 years of carefully constructed reality, of righteous anger and bitter betrayal, crumbled into dust. He had built his fortress of misery on a foundation of lies. And his brother, his charming, handsome, ever-present brother, had been handing him the stones. He turned and strode from the room, leaving Caspian sitting alone in the vast, echoing silence, the 2 empty place settings standing as silent witnesses to a crime Alistair was only just beginning to understand. The scent of beeswax and wilted roses filled his nostrils, the smell of rot in a gilded cage. He was not just a widower of the heart. He was a king in an empty castle, and he had banished his own queen, and, it seemed, his own child. The memory of that night was seared into his mind like a brand. It was 5 years ago, almost to the day. The air in the drawing room had been thick with the cloying scent of hothouse lilies and the unspoken tension that had come to define his marriage. He and Eleanor had been entertaining, or rather, he had been holding court, discussing crop rotation and parliamentary bills with a cluster of local landowners, while Eleanor sat nearby, a book open in her lap, a perfect, silent ornament. He remembered glancing at her, noting the fine spun gold of her hair in the lamplight and the elegant line of her neck. He had felt a flicker of pride, the same pride a man feels for a prize thoroughbred. She was beautiful, well-bred, and a credit to his name. He had not, at that moment, considered if she was happy. Caspian had been at his elbow, as always, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. "She seems distracted tonight, don't you think?" Alistair had grunted, his attention on a conversation about drainage tiles. "A bit pale," Caspian had continued, his gaze sliding towards Eleanor. "I do hope she isn't unwell, or perhaps her thoughts are simply elsewhere." It was insidious the way Caspian worked, a slow, patient poisoning of the well. For months he had been planting these seeds of doubt. A comment on Eleanor's quietness, a suggestion that she was corresponding a little too frequently with a distant cousin, a wry observation about her long, solitary walks in the gardens. Alistair, arrogant and emotionally obtuse, had absorbed it all without question. He trusted his brother implicitly. He had never trusted his own heart, so he had outsourced its protection to a man who wanted to see it broken. The guests had departed late. The house had fallen into a heavy silence. Alistair had retired to his study, not his marital bedroom. It was their habit. He preferred the company of his papers. He was reviewing accounts when Caspian had entered, his face a mask of grave concern. He held a letter in his hand. "Alistair," he had said, his voice heavy with false regret, "I would not show you this if I did not love you. I found it. It must have been dropped in the hall." Alistair took the single sheet of paper. It was Eleanor's elegant script, or a masterful imitation of it. He read the words and the world went cold. It was a love letter, filled with passionate longing and plans for a clandestine meeting. It was addressed to "My dearest G," and spoke of escaping the gilded cage and the cold-hearted jailer to whom she was bound. The rage was a white, hot flash. It burned away all reason, all memory of the gentle woman he had married. It confirmed every poisonous whisper from Caspian. He was a duke. He was Blackwood, and he had been made a fool of in his own house. He stormed from the study, the letter clutched in his hand. He found her in their drawing room, standing by the cold fireplace. She was still in her evening gown of pale blue silk. She looked up as he entered, a small, hopeful smile on her face. "I was waiting for you," she began. "I thought perhaps we could talk." He did not let her finish. He threw the letter onto the table between them. "Explain this." She bent and picked it up. He watched her face as she read, saw the confusion melt into dawning horror. Her skin, already pale, became as white as marble. "Alistair, I did not write this," she whispered, her eyes wide with shock and fear. "This is not my letter." "Do not lie to me," he roared, the sound echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "Your handwriting, your sentiments, your betrayal." "It is not my handwriting," she insisted, her voice gaining strength. "Look closer. It is similar, but it is not mine, and I would never. Who is G?" "Do you take me for a complete idiot?" he sneered, his pride wounded beyond measure. "It is Geoffrey, is it not? Your charming cousin Geoffrey, with whom you take such long, private walks." Her face fell. "Geoffrey? He is my cousin. He leaves for India next week. We were discussing his mother's health." "Alistair, you cannot believe this. This is a lie. A cruel, wicked lie." He saw only guilt in her denial, only deceit in her desperation. Caspian had done his work too well. "I believe what I see," he said, his voice dropping to a blade of ice. "I see a faithless wife who has dishonored my name. I want you out of my house." The words hung in the air between them. Eleanor simply stared at him, her face a mask of stunned disbelief. The hope that had been in her eyes moments before died, extinguished as completely as a snuffed candle. A profound, chilling stillness fell over her. There were no more tears, no more pleas. There was only a vast, empty silence. "You truly believe this?" she said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a final, terrible realization. She was not seeing a husband. She was seeing a judge, a jury, and an executioner, all wrapped in one cold, unyielding package. "I do," he said. She nodded slowly, a single, sharp nod. "Then there is nothing more to be said." She turned and walked from the room. He did not follow her. He stood there, his chest heaving, the rage giving way to a hollow, bitter triumph. He had excised the rot. He had protected his honor. He sank into a chair and poured himself a brandy, the liquor burning a path down his throat, but doing nothing to warm the ice that had formed around his heart. He did not see her leave. He learned later that she had not taken the ducal carriage. She had not packed her lavish wardrobe or her priceless jewels. She had gone to her chambers, and she had walked out of Blackwood Manor with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small reticule. He had found her wedding ring the next morning. It was sitting on the cold marble of the drawing-room mantelpiece, directly under a portrait of his own stern-faced grandfather. It was not thrown. It was placed. A deliberate, final statement. He had left it there. For 5 years it had sat on that mantelpiece, gathering a thin film of dust that Mrs. Gable would dutifully polish away each week. A silent, glittering rebuke. Now, standing in the hall outside the dining room, the memory of that night tasted like ash in his mouth. He had been so certain, so righteous, and so utterly, catastrophically wrong. An heir. Mrs. Gable had said an heir. He strode towards the library, his mind racing. He had to know. He had to find her. Not to drag her back, not to claim his heir like a piece of property, but to understand, to face the truth of what he had done. He burst into the library, his sanctuary of misery, and went straight to the heavy oak desk. He pulled open a drawer, his hand searching for paper and a pen. He needed to write to his solicitor. No, not his solicitor. This required more discretion. He needed an investigator, the best one money could buy. A man who could find a ghost. As his fingers closed around a pen, his eyes fell on a small, leather-bound book on the corner of the desk. It was a book of poetry. Eleanor's. He had not seen her take it, but he had never bothered to clear her things. He had simply had the door to her personal sitting room locked. He picked it up. The leather was soft and worn. He opened it to the flyleaf. In her true hand, the graceful, looping script he now saw was subtly, but definitively different from the forgery, was a single inscription. For Alistair. May you one day find the words. He sank into his chair, the book falling open in his lap. The words blurred before his eyes. He had not found the words. He had used the cruelest ones imaginable, and had condemned them both to this half-life of sorrow and silence. The investigation would not be about finding a faithless wife. It would be a search for his own soul. Eleanor, now known to the world as Ellen, pulled the rough wool shawl tighter around her shoulders. The wind coming off the North Sea had a bite to it, a damp chill that seeped into the bones. It smelled of salt and fish and wet stone, a scent that had replaced the cloying perfumes of her old life. It was the scent of survival. Her cottage was small, just 2 rooms nestled at the edge of the fishing village of Port Caris. The floors were bare wood, scrubbed clean by her own hands. The fire in the hearth was her only source of heat, its crackle and pop a comforting counterpoint to the relentless moan of the wind outside. It was a world away from the echoing, silent grandeur of Blackwood Manor. It was home. A small hand tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, is the stew ready?" She looked down into a pair of eyes, the exact, startling shade of sapphire blue as his father's. They were set in a small, serious face, framed by a mop of dark hair that curled just as Alistair's did. Her son, Thomas, was 5 years old. He was her heart, her reason, her entire world. "Almost, my love," she said, her voice soft. She brushed a stray curl from his forehead. "Go and set the table. Just the 2 of us tonight." He nodded and scurried over to the small wooden table, carefully placing 2 mismatched earthenware bowls and 2 horn spoons. He was a good boy, a thoughtful boy. He knew nothing of dukes or duchesses, of titles or betrayal. He knew only the love of his mother and the rugged kindness of the Port Caris fishermen, who treated him as one of their own. Eleanor stirred the pot of fish stew, the steam warming her face. Her hands, once soft and pale, were now chapped and calloused from mending nets and endless sewing. After fleeing Blackwood, her small purse of money had not lasted long. She had found her way to this remote coastal village, drawn by its anonymity. She had presented herself as Ellen, a widow with a small baby, and had taken on any work she could find. She had discovered she was with child a month after her flight. The realization had come not with joy, but with a cold, terrifying clarity. She was alone, disgraced, and now responsible for another life. That terror had forged her into something new. The fragile, uncertain Duchess had been burned away, leaving behind a woman of iron resolve. Thomas would not suffer for his father's sins. She would protect him. She would provide for him. She had shed her old identity, like a snake sheds its skin. The fine clothes were sold for a pittance. The name Eleanor was buried, but she could not shed the memories. At night, when Thomas was sleeping and the cottage was quiet, the ghost of Alistair would visit her. She remembered not just the coldness and the final, brutal accusation, but the moments before. The rare, fleeting glimpses of the man he could have been. A shared laugh over a clumsy servant. The time he had found her crying in the garden over a letter from her ailing mother, and had sat with her, his silence a strange comfort. These memories were the most dangerous. They whispered of what could have been, a life that had been stolen from them not just by Alistair's pride, but by a deeper, more calculated cruelty. She knew, with a certainty that had settled deep in her bones, that the letter had been a forgery. She suspected Caspian. He had always watched her with a veiled resentment, his charm a thin veneer over a core of bitter jealousy. He wanted Alistair's power, his wealth, and had seen her as an obstacle. But what did it matter now? Alistair had believed the lie. He had chosen to believe it. He had cast her out without a second thought, without a shred of trust. That was a wound that could never be healed. Forgiveness was a luxury she could not afford. Her energy was for survival, for Thomas. She ladled the steaming stew into the 2 bowls. Thomas was humming to himself, arranging the spoons with meticulous care. He looked up at her and smiled, a bright, unguarded expression that squeezed her heart. He had her smile, but he had his father's eyes, a constant, living reminder of a life she had been forced to leave behind. She sat down opposite him, the rough wood of the chair familiar beneath her. They ate in companionable silence, the warmth of the food a small bastion against the cold world outside. She had built this life from the ashes of another. It was a hard life, a poor life, but it was hers, and no one could take it from her. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, in the heart of London, Alistair sat in a dusty, book-lined office. The man across the desk, a Mr. Davies, was small and unassuming, with eyes that missed nothing. He was an investigator, recommended as the most discreet and thorough man in England. "You wish me to find a woman who has been missing for 5 years, Davies said, his voice dry as old paper. "With no name to go on but Ellen, and no location but somewhere in England." "She is the Duchess of Blackwood," Alistair stated, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "Eleanor Beaumont. She would not be using that name. She is resourceful. She is intelligent. She would have gone somewhere remote, a place where a duchess would never be looked for." He pushed a heavy purse across the desk. "I need you to find her, and I need you to investigate the circumstances of her departure. Specifically, a correspondence she was alleged to have had with her cousin, Geoffrey. And this." He slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was not the original forged letter. Caspian had conveniently burned that in the fireplace that night, a gesture of brotherly protection. But Alistair had spent a sleepless night recreating it from memory. Beside it, he placed the book of poetry, open to the flyleaf. "The top is the letter as I recall it. The bottom is her true hand. I want to know if the first could have been forged, and I want to know by whom." He paused. "My brother, Lord Caspian, was the one who brought the letter to my attention." Davies' expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened. "I see. You suspect a family matter, Your Grace." "I suspect I have been a blind and arrogant fool," Alistair said, the confession raw. "Find her. Find the truth. I do not care what it costs." Davies nodded, sweeping the papers and the purse into a drawer. "I will begin with the cousin, Geoffrey, and I will put agents in every remote port and village from Cornwall to Northumberland. If she is in this country, I will find her." The weeks that followed were a special kind of hell for Alistair. He returned to Blackwood, but the house was no longer just empty. It was haunted. Every silent room accused him. He saw Eleanor in the curve of a vase, heard her voice in the rustle of the curtains. He found himself standing in the locked room that had been her sitting room, the key sourced from a protesting Mrs. Gable. The air inside was stale, smelling of dried lavender and regret. Everything was just as she had left it, a book of pressed flowers on a small table, an embroidery hoop with a half-finished wildflower. On her desk, a stack of blank paper and an inkwell. She had been a prolific letter writer, keeping up with friends and family. The idea that she would be so careless as to drop an incriminating note in a public hall was, in retrospect, utterly absurd. He spent his days managing the estate with a grim focus, but his nights were sleepless. He replayed that final, terrible conversation over and over, his own words echoing in his mind, each one a fresh lash of the whip. He had not questioned. He had not listened. He had simply condemned. Caspian watched him with growing unease. His brother's sudden, obsessive interest in the past had unnerved him. "Alistair, you must let this go," Caspian urged one evening, finding the Duke staring into the fire, a glass of untouched brandy in his hand. "You are tormenting yourself over a woman who was unworthy of you." "Was she?" Alistair asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Or was I simply unworthy of her?" "That is nonsense," Caspian said, a little too quickly. "She betrayed you. I was there. I saw the proof." "You saw a letter," Alistair countered, turning to face him. The firelight cast harsh shadows across his face, making him look older, harder. "A letter you conveniently burned before it could be properly examined. A letter about a man who, I have since learned from his family, left for India the very next day and has not returned since." Caspian's composure wavered. A flicker of panic entered his eyes. "It was for the best, to remove the evidence, to protect the family name." "Whose name were you protecting, Caspian?" Alistair asked, his gaze pinning his brother in place. "Mine or yours?" Before Caspian could answer, a footman entered with a sealed packet on a silver tray. It bore Mr. Davies's seal. Alistair took it, his hand steady. He dismissed the footman and broke the seal, his eyes never leaving his brother's face. He read the first page. It was a report on the handwriting. Davies's expert was unequivocal. The remembered letter, while a passable imitation, showed signs of forgery. More damningly, the expert had analyzed a sample of Caspian's own handwriting, procured from a signed receipt at his London tailor. Several key characteristics, the distinctive loop of the G, the sharp angle of the T, were a perfect match. Alistair lowered the paper. The library was deathly quiet. "It was you," he said, the words flat, devoid of heat. The rage had burned out, leaving behind a cold, desolate certainty. "You wrote the letter. You orchestrated the whole thing." Caspian paled dramatically. "That is a preposterous accusation. I am your brother." "You are a viper I have warmed at my own hearth," Alistair said, his voice like chipping stone. He held up the report. "It is all here, the handwriting analysis, the interviews with the servants who you paid to report on Eleanor's private walks, the whole sordid, pathetic conspiracy." Caspian's facade finally shattered. His face twisted into a snarl of pure, undiluted resentment. "She was changing you, making you soft. She would have given you an heir, and I would have been left with nothing. That title, this house, it should have been mine. Our father always preferred you." The confession, raw and childish in its greed, was almost anticlimactic. Alistair felt nothing but a profound, weary disgust. He had not just lost his wife and his child. He had lost a brother he never truly had. "Get out," Alistair said, the words echoing his own 5 years prior. But where his words to Eleanor had been hot with rage, these were cold as the grave. "Pack your things and be gone from this house by morning. You will receive a small, non-negotiable allowance, paid to you in a place of my choosing, far from here. If I ever see your face or hear your name again, it will be cut off. You are no longer my brother. You are nothing to me." Caspian stared at him, his mouth opening and closing, but no sound came out. The finality in Alistair's voice was absolute. Defeated, he turned and fled the room. Alistair stood alone, the report clutched in his hand. The truth was not liberating. It was devastating. It laid the full weight of his failure squarely on his own shoulders. Caspian had provided the weapon, but he, Alistair, had wielded it. He opened the second part of the report. It was from an agent in Northumberland, subject matching description of Ellen located in the fishing village of Port Caris. Lives in a small cottage works as a seamstress, has one child, a boy, approximately 5 years of age, named Thomas. See attached sketch. Alistair's hand trembled as he unfolded the last sheet of paper. It was a simple charcoal sketch. A small boy with a serious face and a wild mop of dark curls, standing on a quay, looking out at the sea, and staring back at Alistair from the page were his own eyes. The journey north was a torment. Every turn of the carriage wheels was a tick of a clock, counting down to a confrontation he both craved and dreaded. He traveled alone, having sent his valet and coachman back from the last major town. He rode the final miles on a hired horse, a plain, unremarkable beast. He wanted to arrive not as a duke, but as a man, though he felt like less than a man. He felt like a penitent, crawling towards the shrine he had desecrated. He found Port Caris huddled against the sea, a jumble of stone cottages and slate roofs under a gray sky. The air was sharp with the tang of salt. He dismounted at the small inn, its sign, The Weary Traveler, creaking in the wind. He secured a room, his movements stiff and automatic. The innkeeper, a stout woman with kind eyes named Mrs. Finch, looked at him with open curiosity but asked no questions beyond what he required for supper. He did not stay at the inn. He walked through the village, his London boots loud on the cobbled streets. He followed the directions from Davies's report, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He found the cottage at the very edge of the village, perched precariously close to the cliff's edge, as if it were contemplating a leap into the churning sea below. A thin curl of smoke rose from its chimney. A light glowed in the window. He stopped in the shadows of a neighboring boat shed, his breath catching in his throat. And then he saw her. She was visible through the small, clean window pane. She was sitting at a table, her head bent over a piece of sewing. The lamplight caught the gold in her hair, but it was not the coiffed, elegant hair of a duchess. It was simpler, pulled back in a practical knot. Her dress was of a dark, coarse fabric. She looked thinner, and there were lines of weariness around her eyes that had not been there before. But she was more beautiful than he had ever remembered. There was a strength in the set of her shoulders, a self-possession in her focused movements that had been absent in the stifling drawing rooms of Blackwood. Then a small boy ran into the frame, holding up a piece of wood. He spoke, his voice too faint for Alistair to hear. Eleanor looked up, and a smile transformed her face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated love. It was a smile he had never once earned from her. The boy turned slightly, and the light caught his face. It was the face from the sketch, but alive, animated. The dark curls, the serious brow, and the eyes. God, the eyes. They were a perfect, shattering mirror of his own. Alistair felt as though the wind had been knocked from him. This was real. A boy, his son, a life that had been growing and thriving in this harsh, beautiful place, entirely without him. The sheer scale of his loss, of what he had thrown away, washed over him in a sickening wave. He had to move. He could not stand lurking in the shadows like a thief. He took a breath, the cold, salty air doing nothing to calm the frantic beating of his heart, and he stepped out into the open. He walked the few remaining yards to the cottage door. It was made of weathered, salt-bleached wood. He raised his hand, his knuckles hovering over the rough surface for a long moment. Then he knocked. The sound was loud in the quiet evening. Inside, the chatter stopped. He heard the scrape of a chair. The door opened. Eleanor stood before him. Her face, illuminated by the warm light from within, was a study in shock. Her eyes widened, the color draining from her cheeks. The smile was gone, replaced by a guarded, hostile stillness. The woman from the drawing room 5 years ago would have gasped, perhaps cried out. This woman did not. She simply stared, her expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low and tight. "Eleanor," he breathed, her name a prayer and a curse on his lips. "I am not Eleanor to you," she said, her voice like ice. "And you have no right to be here. Leave." "Please," he said, the word clumsy and inadequate. "I have to talk to you. I know the truth. About Caspian. About the letter." Her expression did not soften. If anything, it grew colder. "The truth is 5 years too late. It changes nothing. I want you to go." A small figure appeared behind her, peering around her skirts. Thomas. He looked from his mother's rigid back to the tall, dark stranger at the door. His blue eyes were wide with curiosity. Alistair's gaze dropped to the boy. He could not help it. His son. He saw his own features miniaturized, softened by the innocence of childhood. The sight was a knife to the gut. Eleanor saw where he was looking. A fierce, protective fire ignited in her eyes. She moved instinctively, positioning herself more fully in front of Thomas, shielding him from view. "You will not," she hissed, her voice trembling with a terrifying intensity. "You will not come here now and think you have a claim. He is mine. You abandoned him. You abandoned us. You have no rights here." "I did not know," Alistair said, his voice cracking. "Eleanor, I swear to you, I did not know about the child." "And if you had?" she shot back, her words like poisoned darts. "What then? Would you have let me stay, your disgraced wife, hidden away in a back room so you could have your precious heir? Or would you have taken him from me and cast me aside anyway? Do not pretend this is about anything other than your title and your lineage." The accusation struck home because it contained a grain of truth about the man he had been. He flinched as if she had slapped him. "That is not why I am here," he said, struggling to find the words. "I am here because I was wrong. I destroyed our lives based on a lie, and I have to try and make it right." "Make it right?" She let out a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. "You cannot make this right. You cannot give me back the last 5 years. You cannot give my son the father he should have had. There is nothing you can do here but cause more pain. Now, for the last time, Your Grace," she spat the title like a curse, "leave my home." She moved to shut the door. In a moment of pure desperation, Alistair put his hand against it, stopping it. "No, I will not leave. Not until you have heard me out. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I know I have not earned it. I am not asking for anything. But I will not leave Port Caris until you have seen the proof I bring and heard every last word I have to say." He looked past her, at the small, frightened face of his son. "I will not abandon him again." Eleanor stared at him, her chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. She saw not the arrogant duke who had condemned her, but a broken man standing on her doorstep, his face etched with a pain that mirrored her own. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. Slowly she removed her hand from the door. She did not open it further. "The inn in the village is called The Weary Traveler," she said, her voice flat and emotionless. "You may stay there. Do not come to this house again unless I send for you. Do not approach my son. Those are my terms." "I accept them," he said without hesitation. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she shut the door in his face. The latch clicked into place with a sound of utter finality. Alistair stood on the doorstep, the cold wind whipping around him. He had found her. He had seen his son. And he had been utterly, completely rejected. It was no less than he deserved. He turned and walked back towards the inn, not as a duke claiming his rights, but as a supplicant beginning his penance. Life in the inn was a stark lesson in humility. His room was small and clean, with a lumpy mattress and a single window that overlooked a noisy stable yard. The smells were of hay and horse, not beeswax and polish. He ate his meals in the common room, simple fare of bread, cheese, and stew, surrounded by fishermen whose hands were as calloused as Eleanor's. They eyed him with suspicion. this well-dressed stranger who had appeared in their midst. But they left him alone. He kept to his word. He did not approach the cottage, but he saw them. He would walk the cliff path in the mornings and see Eleanor heading to the docks to collect mending, a large basket on her hip. He would see Thomas playing with other children on the beach, his laughter carried on the wind. Each sighting was a fresh twist of the knife, a reminder of the simple, domestic life he had forfeited. He began to understand the rhythm of their existence. It was a life dictated by the tides and the seasons, a life of hard work and small comforts. He saw Eleanor haggling with a merchant over the price of thread, her expression firm and businesslike. He saw her comforting a neighbor whose husband's boat was late returning from the sea. She was not just a survivor. She was a part of this community, respected and valued. He, with his title and his wealth, was the outsider. After a week of this self-imposed exile, a package arrived from Mr. Davies. It contained the original reports, the signed testimony from the handwriting expert, and a sworn affidavit from the cousin, Geoffrey, now back in England, detailing his innocent conversations with Eleanor and his utter shock at the accusations. It also contained a detailed account of Caspian's finances, showing a string of gambling debts that had provided a powerful motive for his desperate act. Alistair did not take the papers to the cottage. He took them to Mrs. Finch at the inn. "Mrs. Finch," he said, approaching the bar where she was polishing glasses, "I have a favor to ask. I know you are friends with Ellen, with the seamstress." "I am," she said, her expression wary. "She is a good woman, and a good mother." The unspoken warning was clear. "I know she is," Alistair said quietly. "I have behaved abominably towards her. I am trying to atone for it. I will not trouble her directly, but I need her to see these. They are papers that prove her innocence in a matter from a long time ago. They prove that she was the victim of a terrible lie." He placed the leather portfolio on the bar. "Would you be willing to take them to her? Tell her they are from me. She can read them or burn them as she sees fit. But I ask that you at least give her the choice." Mrs. Finch studied his face for a long moment. She saw the exhaustion, the deep, abiding sadness in his eyes. She had heard the whispers in the village, seen the way he watched Eleanor and the boy from a distance. This was not the behavior of a tyrant come to claim his property. It was the behavior of a man consumed by regret. "All right," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I will take them to her, but I make no promises, Your Grace." "Thank you," he said, the relief so profound it almost buckled his knees. "And please, call me Alistair." She gave a curt nod, took the portfolio, and wrapped it in a clean cloth. Eleanor was mending a sail in her small front garden when Mrs. Finch arrived. Thomas was at her feet, attempting to carve a piece of driftwood with a blunt knife. "A visitor for you," Mrs. Finch said, holding out the cloth-wrapped package. "From the gentleman at the inn." Eleanor's hands stilled. She looked at the package as if it were a venomous snake. "I told him not to contact me." "He did not," the innkeeper replied. "He asked me to bring it, said you could burn it if you wished, but that he wanted you to have the choice to read it. He says it's proof." Eleanor hesitated. Her first instinct was to refuse, to tell Mrs. Finch to throw it in the sea, but curiosity, a small, treacherous flicker of it, stayed her hand. What proof could he possibly have that would change a single thing? She took the package. That night, after Thomas was asleep, she sat by the fire and untied the cloth. She laid the papers out on her small table. She read Davies's dry, factual report. She saw the side-by-side comparison of the handwriting, Caspian's arrogant loops next to the forger's imitation. She read Geoffrey's affidavit, his words filled with familial affection and bewilderment. She read the cold, hard accounting of Caspian's debts. It was all there. A meticulous, undeniable dismantling of the lie that had shattered her life. She had suspected Caspian, but she had never imagined the depth of his treachery, or the evidence that could prove it. She sat there for a long time, The papers spread before her like the wreckage of a shipwreck. The proof did not bring her relief. It brought a fresh wave of anger, colder and deeper than before. It was not just that Alistair had been deceived. It was that he had been so willing to be deceived. He had not trusted her, not for a single moment. He had trusted the brother who so clearly envied him, the man whose flattery had always dripped with poison. But as the anger crested, it left something else in its wake, a sliver of grudging understanding. He had been a fool, an arrogant, blind fool, but he had not been malicious. He had been a victim, too, in his own way. And now he was here, not demanding, not commanding, but waiting, living in a sparse room at the inn, accepting her terms, sending his proof via an intermediary like a chastened schoolboy. It was not the act of the Duke she had known. The next day she sent a message with one of the village boys, a single sentence on a scrap of paper. The North Cliff Path, at sunset. He was there, waiting, a tall, dark silhouette against the fiery sky. The wind was brisk, whipping at his coat and tugging at her shawl. They stood several feet apart, the space between them charged with 5 years of silence and pain. "You read them," he said. It was not a question. "I did," she replied, her voice steady. "They confirm what I already knew in my heart, that I was innocent, and that your brother was a snake." "He is gone," Alistair said. "I have disowned him. He will never trouble you, or this family again." "This family," she repeated, an edge of bitterness in her tone. "There is no family. There is me, and there is my son. We are not your family, Alistair." The use of his first name, even in anger, was a small crack in the ice. "I know," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I know I have no right to that word. But he is my son, Eleanor. I see it every time I look at him. And I cannot, I will not, walk away from him now that I know he exists." "And what do you propose to do?" she asked, crossing her arms against the chill. "Buy him a pony? Shower him with gifts he does not need? Do you think you can purchase a father's place in his life?" "No," he said, turning to face her fully. His face was stark in the fading light. "I want to earn it, if you will let me. I am not asking to return to Blackwood. I'm not asking you to be my Duchess. I'm asking for a chance to know my son, to let him know me, and a chance to show you that I am not the man I was." He took a step closer. "I have spent the last week in this village. I have done nothing but watch you. I have seen your strength, your kindness, your place in this community. You have built a life here, a real life, from the rubble of the one I destroyed. I have never admired anyone more." Her breath hitched. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that was not one of them. "Admiration changes nothing," she whispered. "I know," he said. "Action is all that matters now. Let me stay. Not as a duke, but as a man. Let me be useful. The inn needs a new roof. Your fence is broken. I am strong, and I am willing to work. Let me show you, not tell you, that I have changed." She searched his eyes, looking for the pride, the arrogance she knew so well. It was gone. In its place was a desperate sincerity, a deep, humbling sorrow. He was not trying to command her. He was petitioning her. "And Thomas?" she asked, her voice soft. "I will abide by your rules. I will not approach him unless you permit it. I will be whatever you want me to be to him. A stranger, a friend. In time, perhaps, something more. The choice will be yours, and his." A gust of wind blew a strand of hair across her face. Before she could brush it away, he reached out, his fingers gently tucking it behind her ear. His touch was hesitant, respectful. It sent a jolt through her, a warmth that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with a long, dormant memory of affection. She stepped back, breaking the contact. The wall around her heart was still there, but a single, tiny brick had been loosened. "The inn's roof is a disgrace," she said, her tone businesslike, betraying none of the turmoil inside her. "Mrs. Finch will be grateful for the help." It was not forgiveness. It was not an invitation, but it was not a rejection. It was a beginning. Alistair started work the next day. He shed his fine London coat for a simple workman's shirt and breeches, bought from the village draper. The fisherman watched in stunned silence as the Duke of Blackwood climbed onto the roof of the inn with a hammer and a bucket of tar. The work was hard, his hands quickly blistering and then callousing. But the physical exertion was a relief, a way to channel the restless, guilty energy that consumed him. He worked from dawn until dusk, speaking little, focusing only on the task at hand. Mrs. Finch would bring him water and food, her initial wariness slowly giving way to a grudging respect. Eleanor watched him from a distance. She saw him refuse help from the local men, insisting on doing the work himself. She saw him pause one afternoon to help a child who had fallen and scraped his knee, his movements gentle and sure. She saw him talking with an old fisherman, not with the condescension of a nobleman, but with the genuine interest of one man listening to another. Thomas, too, was curious. "Who is that man, Mamma?" he asked one day, pointing towards the inn. "That is Mr. Beaumont," Eleanor replied carefully. "He is a visitor to the village." "He is very tall," Thomas observed. "Taller than anyone." A few days later, Thomas was playing on the quay when he dropped the small, carved wooden bird he always carried. It fell through a gap in the planks, landing on a crossbeam just out of reach. His face crumpled, and he was about to burst into tears when a shadow fell over him. It was Alistair. He had been walking back from the lumber merchant and had seen the whole thing. He did not say a word to Thomas. He simply knelt, lay flat on the rough, splintery wood of the quay, and stretched his long arm down through the gap. His fingers brushed the toy, nudged it, and finally closed around it. He pulled it up and placed it on the planks beside the boy. Then, without a word, he stood up, nodded once, and walked away. Thomas stared at the bird, then at the retreating back of the tall man. He looked over at his mother, who had watched the entire exchange from her doorway, her heart pounding. That evening, Eleanor found Alistair by the sea wall, staring out at the water. He was cleaning tar from his hands with a rag and sand. "Thank you," she said quietly. He looked up, surprised. "It was nothing." "It was not nothing. That bird is his most prized possession. I carved it for him on his first birthday." They stood in silence for a moment. "He is a fine boy, Eleanor," Alistair said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have done an incredible job with him." "I have done what any mother would do," she replied. He finally scrubbed the last of the tar from his hands and turned to her. In his palm, something glinted in the twilight. It was her wedding ring. He had brought it from Blackwood. "This is yours," he said, holding it out to her. He did not try to put it on her finger. He did not ask her to wear it. He simply offered it, a piece of their shared past returned to its rightful owner. "I should never have let you leave it behind." She looked at the ring, then at his face. She saw the raw vulnerability there, the hope and the fear warring in his eyes. She reached out and took it. The metal was cool against her skin. She closed her fingers around it. "The fence at the cottage is broken," she said softly. "The latch on the gate has been rusted through for a month." A slow smile spread across Alistair's face. It was the first genuine smile she had seen from him, and it lit up his tired features, giving her a glimpse of the man he might have been all along. "I will fix it tomorrow," he promised. He fixed the fence. He repaired the roof of her shed. He chopped a winter's worth of firewood and stacked it neatly against the cottage wall. He did not speak of the past, of Blackwood, or of what the future might hold. He simply worked, his actions a steady, quiet drumbeat of atonement. He began to speak with Thomas. It started with a simple hello, then a question about his wooden bird. Soon Thomas would seek him out, chattering away about the ships in the harbor or a crab he had found in a rock pool. Alistair would listen, his expression one of rapt attention, his heart aching with a mixture of joy and profound loss for all the years he had missed. One evening, a fierce storm rolled in from the sea. The wind howled like a banshee, and rain lashed against the small cottage. A loud crack from the main room sent Eleanor running, with Alistair, who had been helping her secure the shutters, close behind. A heavy beam in the ceiling had split under the strain, and water was pouring in. Without hesitation, they worked together, moving furniture, placing every pot and bucket they could find to catch the deluge. They were soaked to the skin, their shouted words barely audible over the roar of the storm. In the chaos, in the shared, frantic purpose of saving her home, the last of the walls between them crumbled. When the worst of the leak was contained, they stood in the dim, damp room, breathing heavily. The fire had been doused by the water, and the only light came from a single, sputtering lantern. "It seems my roof is next on your list of repairs," Eleanor said, a hint of wry humor in her voice. Alistair looked at her, at the rainwater dripping from her hair and tracing a path down her cheek. He reached out and gently wiped the drop away with his thumb. "I will rebuild the whole house for you, if you will let me," he said, his voice low and earnest. She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, a silent surrender. "Alistair," she whispered. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. It was gentle, questioning, full of 5 years of unspoken sorrow and a fragile, burgeoning hope. She returned it, her hand coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they broke apart, the storm outside still raged, but inside the small, damaged cottage there was a profound and peaceful quiet. They did not return to Blackwood immediately. They stayed in Port Caris through the winter, living as a family in the small cottage Alistair had repaired with his own hands. He was not a duke here. He was Alistair, the man who could fix any fence and who told the best bedtime stories, his deep voice a comforting rumble in the quiet nights. He was Tom's father. He was Eleanor's husband. She began to wear the wedding ring again, not because she was a duchess, but because she was his wife. They had been forged anew in the crucible of Port Caris, their love rebuilt not on a foundation of privilege and duty, but on one of mutual respect, hard work, and earned forgiveness. When spring came, they returned to Blackwood. The news of their arrival and of the long-lost heir sent shockwaves through the aristocracy. But Alistair and Eleanor paid them no mind. The great house felt different. Thomas's laughter echoed in the halls that had once been suffocated by silence. Eleanor, no longer a decorative ornament, took an active role in managing the estate. Drawing on her experiences in Port Caris, she established funds and programs to support the wives and children of the tenant farmers, ensuring no other woman would face the desperation she had known. Alistair supported her in everything. His pride now centered not on his title, but on the incredible woman by his side. One Sunday, they sat down to dinner in the grand dining room. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The table was no longer a vast, lonely expanse. It was set for 3. Mrs. Gable entered, carrying a tureen of soup. Her steps were lighter than they had been in years. A genuine, contented smile graced her lips as she served the Duke, then the Duchess, then the small, dark-haired boy who sat between them, chattering happily about a frog he had found by the pond. The 2 empty places were gone. The ghosts had been laid to rest. The house was finally, truly full,